I got fired after 35 years because I was too old, so I did something that left everyone speechless. You know that feeling when life sucker punches you right in the gut? Yeah, that was me 3 months ago, standing in the principal's office of Millbrook High School in Georgia, watching my whole world crumble like a day-old biscuit. Eddie Russell, that's me, 60 years old, been teaching American history for 35 years to kids who thought the Civil War was fought over Netflix passwords. But I love those knuckleheads. Every single one of them. Called them my future presidents. Even the ones who couldn't find Washington, D.C. on a map if you spotted them the Potomac River. My classroom was like stepping into a time machine. Vintage Frank Sinatra records lined the windowsill. My beat-up tweed jacket hung on the same hook for 2 decades. And yeah, I still use a chalkboard. Sue me. There's something magical about the sound of chalk on slate that these fancy smart boards just can't replicate. It's like the difference between a handwritten love letter and a text message. Those kids understood that history isn't just dates and dead presidents. It's stories. Stories about regular folks who face impossible odds and somehow found a way through. That's what mattered to me, teaching them that they could be part of something bigger than themselves. But apparently, none of that mattered to Principal Bradley Morrison, a 30-something hotshot with an MBA and the personality of a soggy pretzel. This guy showed up last fall talking about modernization, efficiency, and synergy. I should have known I was in trouble when he started using the word pivot in every other sentence. The faculty meeting that changed everything happened on a Thursday. I remember because Thursdays were always my favorite. That's when I taught about the Revolutionary War, and I get all fired up talking about how a bunch of farmers took on the British Empire with nothing but grit and determination. Morrison stood at the front of the conference room in his shiny suit, clicking through a PowerPoint presentation that looked like it was designed by a robot. Budget cuts, he said. Streamlining operations. The district needed to make some tough choices. Then he looked straight at me with those cold blue eyes and delivered the knockout punch. Eddie, your chalkboards are museum pieces. Time for retirement. The way he said it, like he was doing me some kind of favor. Like 35 years of dedication was just outdated inventory that needed clearing out. But here's the real kicker, and this is where it gets ugly. Morrison had been scheming for months to get rid of me. Not because I was a bad teacher, but because he wanted to hire his cousin's daughter fresh out of college. 22 years old with zero experience. But she had the right last name. Nepotism wrapped up in a nice little bow called budget efficiency. The other teachers just sat there, staring at their hands. These were people I'd mentored. Folks I'd cover for when they were going through divorces or dealing with sick kids. Not one of them said a word. Cowardice spreads faster than gossip in a small town. When I tried to speak up, to defend myself, Morrison cut me off faster than a Sunday dinner prayer. Your methods are outdated. Eddie, these kids need 21st century learning, not dusty old stories. He dismissed Washington, Jefferson, and Lincoln like they were yesterday's trash. Men who literally built this country from scratch, reduced to irrelevant footnotes by this pencil-necked bureaucrat. The humiliation wasn't over. Morrison reached into a cardboard box beside his desk and pulled out something that made my blood freeze. Mom's old recipe notebook. See, I left that notebook in the school cafeteria after Mom died 5 years ago. Figure it belonged there since she spent 40 years feeding kids in that kitchen. Someone must have handed it over Morrison when he started his great purge of old school items. The notebook was stained with decades of love, flour, and memories. Etta's Kitchen, 1963. The faded cover read. Morrison looked at it with disgust and placed it on the edge of his desk like it was contaminated. This is your personal junk, Eddie. When the notebook slipped and fell to the floor, pages scattering, several teachers gasped. Nobody moved to help. I wanted to punch that smug little weasel right in his perfectly straight teeth. Instead, I got down on my knees and gathered up those precious pages while Morrison kept talking about efficiency metrics and performance indicators. My hands were shaking, whether from rage or heartbreak. I couldn't tell. That notebook was all that was left of my mother, Etta Russell. She'd worked in the school cafeteria for 40 years, feeding half the town's kids her famous apple pie and cornbread. Inside were handwritten recipes in her careful cursive, notes about which kids had food allergies, reminders to pack extra sandwiches for families going through hard times. The meeting ended with Morrison announcing that my last day would be Friday. No ceremony, no thank you for your service, no recognition of the thousands of kids I'd taught over the decades. Just a pink slip and a security escort to clean out my desk. You know what made it worse? The pension nightmare that followed. Turns out there was a coding error in the district's new computer system. My job classification got mixed up with a part-time substitute position. The pension office wouldn't budge until it was fixed, which could take 6 months. Nobody even apologized for the screw-up. Suddenly, I was 60 years old with no income, no health insurance, and no idea what to do with the rest of my life. Margaret had been gone for 5 years. The kids lived across the country, and now I didn't even have my classroom to give my days meaning. The American dream, right there in all its glory. What surprised me most was the reaction from the community. You'd think after 35 years of teaching their kids, someone might have raised hell about my firing. But small-town politics are complicated. Morrison had connections, and people were afraid to speak up. A few parents called me privately to express their outrage, but public support? That's a different story. I spent that final Friday afternoon boxing up my classroom. 35 years of teaching reduced to 3 cardboard boxes and a manila folder full of termination paperwork. The kids kept stopping by, asking if it was true that Mr. Russell was really leaving. Some of them actually cried. These tough teenagers who thought showing emotion was social suicide were tearing up over an old history teacher. Sarah Martinez, one of my brightest students, slipped me a note as she left. Mr. Russell, you taught me that history isn't about memorizing dates. It's about understanding that ordinary people can do extraordinary things. Thank you for making me believe I could be extraordinary too. I had to step into the hallway and compose myself after reading that. All those years of teaching, and it came down to moments like that, moments when you realize you actually made a difference, even if the bureaucrats couldn't see it on their spreadsheets. The security guard, old Pete, who'd been working at the school almost as long as I'd been teaching, helped me carry my boxes to the parking lot. He didn't say much, but he patted my shoulder as we walked. Pete understood. He'd seen plenty of good teachers get pushed out by administrators who cared more about politics than kids. Standing in that empty parking lot, holding Mom's recipe notebook, I felt smaller than I'd ever felt in my life. The Georgia sun was beating down on the asphalt, making waves of heat rise up like ghosts. The school building looked different from the outside, less like a place of learning, and more like a fortress I'd been exiled from. I thought about what Mom used to tell me when I was a kid, back when she was working double shifts at the diner to keep us afloat after Dad left. Life is like a pie, Eddie. Sometimes it crumbles, but the taste depends on you. She had a way of making everything sound simple, even when it wasn't. The drive home was a blur of familiar streets that suddenly felt foreign. I'd driven the same route for decades, but now it felt like I was seeing it through different eyes. The old oak trees, the historical markers I'd used in my lessons, the houses where former students lived, all of it belonged to a life that was ending. My apartment was exactly as I'd left it that morning. Coffee cup in the sink. Frank Sinatra's greatest hits still spinning on the turntable. The newspaper folded to the crossword puzzle I'd started but never finished. It was like walking into a museum of my own existence. I set the notebook on the kitchen table and stared at it for the longest time. The cover was water-stained and dog-eared, held together with Scotch tape that had yellowed with age. Some of the pages were stuck together with what looked like maple syrup or maybe gravy. I couldn't tell. I opened a beer, Budweiser, because I'm nothing if not predictable, and sat down at the table. The apartment felt too quiet without the constant hum of teenagers arguing about homework or asking for bathroom passes. Funny how you don't realize how much noise kids make until they're gone. The silence was broken by the sound of my upstairs neighbor, Mrs. Patterson's television. She was watching Wheel of Fortune, and I could hear her shouting answers at the screen like Vanna White was personally holding her family hostage. Mrs. Patterson had been my neighbor for 15 years, and she'd never once gotten a puzzle right. But that didn't stop her from trying. I picked up the notebook again, feeling the weight of it in my hands. It couldn't have weighed more than a pound, but somehow it felt heavier than all the textbooks I'd carried over the years. Part of me wanted to throw it away, to get rid of this reminder of everything I'd lost. But another part of me, the part that sounded suspiciously like Mom's voice, whispered that maybe there was still some use left in this old thing. I opened it carefully, and the pages fell to a recipe for apple pie, written in Mom's careful handwriting with notes in the margins about temperature adjustments and timing. At the bottom of the page, in faded blue ink, she'd written something I'd never noticed before. For my Eddie, cook with love, and the world will love you back. That's when I heard it. 3 gentle knocks on my door. Mrs. Patterson's voice called through the thin wood, asking if I had any sugar she could borrow for her morning coffee. It was almost 8 o'clock at night, and she was thinking about tomorrow's coffee. That's the kind of forward planning that got America through 2 world wars and the Great Depression. I looked down at the notebook in my hands, then at the door where my neighbor was waiting. For the first time in days, I almost smiled. Maybe Mom was right about that pie philosophy after all. Standing up from the table, I realized I was still holding the notebook. The recipe pages felt different now. Not like a reminder of loss, but like something that might still have purpose. The knocking came again, more insistent this time. Mrs. Patterson wasn't the patient type, and she'd been known to use her spare key if people didn't answer fast enough. I walked toward the door, still holding the notebook, wondering if maybe this was exactly where my story was supposed to begin. I opened the door to find Miss Lizzie standing there with a sugar bowl in one hand and the biggest grin I'd seen since the Carter administration. This 70-year-old firecracker had been my upstairs neighbor for going on 15 years, and she had a knack for showing up exactly when you needed her most, even if you didn't know it yet. Eddie, honey, you look like you went 10 rounds with a bulletin board and lost every single one. She handed me the sugar bowl and pushed past me into my apartment like she owned the place. That's Miss Lizzie for you. Subtlety was never her strong suit. The next few weeks blurred together, like a bad hangover that just wouldn't quit. My apartment started smelling like old carpet and loneliness, mixed with a faint aroma of disappointment. Margaret had been gone 5 years now, and our kids Tommy and Susan were out in California living their own lives. They called maybe once a month, usually when they needed something or remembered they had a father back in Georgia. I'd wake up around noon, shuffle to the kitchen in yesterday's clothes, and stare at the coffee maker like it held the answers to life's biggest mysteries. The days stretched out like taffy, each one longer and more meaningless than the last. Retirement wasn't supposed to feel like solitary confinement, but here I was, counting the hours until bedtime. Miss Lizzie became my unofficial wellness check. She'd knock on my door every few days with some excuse. Needed to borrow salt. Wanted to know if I'd heard about Mrs. Henderson's cat. Wondered if I thought it might rain. Really, she was making sure I hadn't given up on living entirely. Smart woman, that Miss Lizzie. One Tuesday morning, she showed up with a thermos of coffee and a look of determination that would have made Patton proud. Eddie Russell. She announced, "You're starting to smell like defeat, and it ain't attractive on a man your age. Time to do something besides feel sorry for yourself." That's when she spotted Mom's recipe notebook sitting on my kitchen table, where it had been gathering dust for 3 weeks. Her eyes lit up like Christmas morning. Lord have mercy. Is that Eda's old cookbook? I haven't seen this thing in years. Your mama was always tinkering with these recipes, making notes about what worked and what didn't. I'd been avoiding that notebook like it carried the plague. Every time I looked at it, I saw Mom's handwriting and remembered everything I'd lost. My job, my purpose, my connection to something bigger than myself. But Miss Lizzie had different ideas about wallowing in self-pity. She flipped through the pages with the reverence most people reserve for family Bibles. Look at this, Eddie. Apple pie, cornbread, beef stew, and look at all these little notes in the margins. Your mama never forgot a single detail about what people liked. The apple pie recipe was on page 12, written in Mom's careful cursive with annotations that made my chest tight. Add extra cinnamon for the Mitchell boy. Use less sugar for Mrs. Patterson's diabetes. Bake at 375, not 350. Eddie's oven runs hot. She'd remembered details about my crappy apartment oven from when I was 20 years old. That's the kind of person Mom was. She paid attention to the small stuff because she knew that's what mattered most. Miss Lizzie started rummaging through my cabinets like she was conducting a military operation. You ever made a pie before, Eddie? I had to come clean. The last time I'd held a rolling pin was 1975, helping Margaret with Thanksgiving dinner. That experiment ended with store-bought pumpkin pie and a promise to stick to carving the turkey. I brought some apples and flour. She said, pulling supplies out of a grocery bag I hadn't noticed her carrying. The rest, I bet we can scavenge from Henderson's pantry. She owes me from last week's bingo game. She owes everyone from bingo, but that's another story. Something about seeing Mom's handwriting, reading her little notes about making people happy with food, stirred something in me that had been dormant for months. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe it was boredom. Or maybe it was a ghost of every lesson I'd ever taught about ordinary people doing extraordinary things when they had to. I decided to give it a shot. How hard could it be, right? Mom's recipes were written like they were meant for someone who'd never seen a kitchen before. Step-by-step instructions that assumed you knew nothing and forgave everything. Surely I could manage one apple pie. The first attempt was what you might charitably call a learning experience. I mixed the dough too much, rolled it too thin, and somehow managed to burn the edges while leaving the middle completely raw. The result looked like something you'd find at an archaeological dig, a blackened artifact from a civilization that had given up on the concept of edible food. Miss Lizzie took one look at my culinary disaster and burst out laughing. Eddie, honey, I've seen some sad pies in my day, but this one looks like it's filing for unemployment. Then she got that mischievous look in her eyes. You know what? This is too good not to share. You mind if I film this tragedy for posterity? Now I know what you're thinking. TikTok? Really? But Miss Lizzie's granddaughter ran a viral gardening channel, and somehow Lizzie had become the wisecracking sidekick, with a following of her own. Garden wisdom mixed with small-town sass. Turns out that's exactly what the internet was hungry for. I groaned, but couldn't help smiling. Fine, Lizzie. If you're going to post this disaster, at least tag me as Burnt Piety. She pulled out her phone and started recording me as I stared at the smoking wreckage in my oven, muttering words that would have made a sailor blush. She filmed me pulling that burnt offering out of the oven, while the smoke alarm wailed like a banshee. I was waving a dish towel around like I was surrendering to the Confederacy, and Miss Lizzie was cackling in the background like she'd just watched the funniest movie of her life. The caption she posted was pure gold. Neighbor Eddie's trying his mama's apple pie recipe from 1963. Day 1. The pie looks like it fought a war and lost, but somehow it still smells like childhood. Hashtag RetroPie Challenge. Hashtag baking disaster. Hashtag old dog's new tricks. I went to bed that night feeling like I'd wasted a perfectly good afternoon and about $15 worth of ingredients. The apartment still smelled like burnt apples and crushed dreams. But when I woke up the next morning, Miss Lizzie was pounding on my door like the building was on fire. Eddie, you need to see this. The video's starting to take off. I thought she was pulling my leg until she shoved her phone in my face. The video had a few thousand views and was climbing. Not exactly viral yet, but it was gaining momentum. People were sharing their own baking disasters, posting pictures of their grandmother's recipe cards, and telling stories about learning to cook from family members who were no longer around. One woman from Ohio wrote about trying to recreate her mother's chocolate cake and ending up with what she called a chocolate hockey puck. A guy from Texas shared a photo of his grandmother's biscuit attempt that looked like geological specimens. The comments that really got to me were about smell and memory, how the scent of cinnamon could transport you back to being 8 years old in your grandmother's kitchen, how food wasn't just about nutrition. It was about connection, comfort, and caring for the love of people who were gone. Miss Lizzie was practically vibrating with excitement. Look at this, Eddie. People are starting to ask about the recipe. Some lady from Michigan wants to know if you'll try again. I told her I'd check with you, but I had a feeling you weren't ready to give up on your mama's pie just yet. That's when it hit me. These weren't just random strangers making jokes about burnt pie. These were people who understood what I was trying to do, even if I didn't understand it myself. They got that this wasn't really about baking. It was about connection, about keeping something precious alive. I decided to give the pie another shot. This time, I read Mom's recipe like it was a sacred text, paying attention to every little note and adjustment. I measured ingredients like I was conducting a chemistry experiment. I treated that rolling pin with the respect it deserved. And when I got frustrated, which happened about every 5 minutes, I could almost hear Mom's voice telling me to slow down and remember that cooking was about love, not perfection. The second pie wasn't perfect, but it was edible. The crust was only slightly lopsided. The filling didn't try to escape. And when I took that first bite, something magical happened. The taste hit me like a freight train loaded with childhood memories. I was 8 years old again, standing on a step stool in Mom's kitchen, sneaking pieces of raw pie dough when she wasn't looking. She'd chase me away with a wooden spoon, but she was always laughing. The kitchen would be warm from the oven, and the whole house would smell like cinnamon and home. I hadn't cried since Margaret's funeral, but sitting there in my quiet apartment, eating a slice of pie that actually tasted like Mom's, the tears came like a summer storm. It was like she was in the room with me, telling me everything was going to be okay. Miss Lizzie found me like that, sitting at my kitchen table with tears streaming down my face and pie crumbs on my shirt. She didn't say anything at first, just sat down across from me and waited. Finally, she reached over and patted my hand. "That's it, isn't it, Eddie? That's the taste you were looking for." She took a bite of the pie and closed her eyes. "Lord Almighty, that takes me back. Your mama had something special in her hands, and it looks like some of that magic got passed down to you." Then she picked up her phone again. "We need to document this victory. Honey, the people need to see that you figured it out." The second video was completely different from the first. Instead of smoke and chaos, it showed me carefully slicing the pie, the camera catching the steam rising from the perfectly golden crust. Miss Lizzie's commentary was softer this time, more reverent. "Day 2. Eddie cracked the code. This is what love looks like when it's baked at 375 degrees for 45 minutes. Within a few hours, the video had thousands of views. The comments section turned into a virtual support group for people trying to recreate family recipes. But the comments that stopped me cold were the ones asking about buying pies. "Where can I order one of these?" wrote someone from Florida. "I'd pay good money for a slice of that nostalgia." A woman from Arizona asked if I shipped nationwide. A guy from New York wanted to know if I took custom orders for family reunions. Tommy and Susan even dropped heart emoji under the video, the first time they'd acknowledged my existence in months. I showed the comments to Miss Lizzie, and she got that look in her eyes again. "Eddie, honey, I think the universe is trying to tell you something. These people aren't just hungry for pie. They're hungry for what that pie represents. They want to feel connected to something real, something made with care." I stared at those comments for a long time that night, reading stories from people who missed their grandmother's cooking, who were trying to keep family traditions alive, who wanted to feed their own families the foods that had nourished their souls. I promised a few people I'd think about it, but honestly, I didn't know what to say. The idea of actually selling pies seemed as foreign as teaching teenagers to care about the Revolutionary War. Sometimes to find yourself, you need to bake a pie, or burn one in my case. I'd spent 35 years teaching kids about history, but maybe I'd been thinking about it all wrong. Maybe the past wasn't just something you studied. Maybe it was something you could taste, something you could share. Miss Lizzie's voice echoed in my head. "People aren't just paying for pie, Eddie. They're paying for memories, for comfort, for a taste of home." And sitting there in my apartment that still smelled like cinnamon and success, I started to wonder if maybe I'd stumbled onto something bigger than I'd imagined. But the idea of actually running a business? That seemed impossible. I mean, I was a history teacher, not an entrepreneur. What did I know about profit margins and food safety regulations and shipping logistics? Then again, 3 days ago, I couldn't make a pie that didn't look like it belonged in a horror movie. Now I had people from half a dozen states asking where they could buy one. Maybe impossible was just another word for something I hadn't figured out yet. I scrolled to the comments one more time, seeing all those requests, all those stories, all that hunger for something real and homemade and filled with love. And for the first time since I'd been fired, I felt something that might have been hope working its way up from my chest. The universe had a funny way of sending messages. Maybe this was mine. The question was I brave enough to listen? Or was I going to keep sitting in my apartment, feeling sorry for myself while opportunity knocked on my door, disguised as apple pie and social media fame? I looked at Mom's notebook, still open to the apple pie recipe, and wondered what she would say if she could see me now. Probably something about how life gives you apples and flour, and it's up to you to decide what to make with them. Life has a funny way of kicking you when you're down, then handing you a ladder when you least expect it. I spent the next week staring at those TikTok comments like they were written in ancient hieroglyphics. People wanted to buy my pies. Real people with real money, asking a 60-year-old washed-up history teacher to ship them slices of nostalgia. The problem was, I knew about as much about running a business as I knew about rocket science. Less, actually. At least I'd taught kids about the space program. Business? That was uncharted territory for a guy whose biggest financial decision was usually whether to buy name-brand cereal. That's when Miss Lizzie's grandson Kyle showed up at my door, laptop in hand, and a grin that reminded me of every student who'd ever had a crazy idea that just might work. This kid was 20 years old, all elbows and enthusiasm, making a living as some kind of freelance computer wizard. He fixed websites, designed apps, and spoke in acronyms that made my head spin. Grandma Lizzie told me about your pie situation, he said, settling into my kitchen chair like he owned the place. You need an online presence, Mr. Russell. These people want to give you money, but they need a way to do it that doesn't involve carrier pigeons. The whole thing terrified me. I'm 60 years old, Kyle. I'm a historian, not a pastry chef. What if I mess this up? What if these people expect some kind of professional operation, and all they get is an old man with a recipe book? Kyle just laughed. Grandpa Eddie, you're going to be a social media star faster than I can update your Windows 98 setup. He glanced at my ancient computer, sitting in the corner like a museum piece. Don't worry about the tech stuff. I'll handle all the social media and website management. You just focus on the baking. Within 2 hours, Kyle had created something called an Etsy shop. Pies and Memories, he called it, with a logo that looked like Mom's handwriting and a description that made my little pie adventure sound like a cross between Martha Stewart and Norman Rockwell. He used words like artisanal and heritage and small batch, terms that made my simple apple pie sound like it belonged in a fancy food magazine. This internet marketplace for hipsters, I called it, which made Kyle nearly fall off his chair laughing. Mr. Russell, these hipsters have money, and they love stories like yours. Besides, I'll be running the TikTok and Instagram accounts. You still type like you're sending telegrams. The money situation was the real problem. My pension was still tied up in bureaucratic red tape, and I had maybe $200 to my name, barely enough for ingredients, let alone packaging, shipping, or any of the other dozen things Kyle kept mentioning. That's when something miraculous happened. One of the TikTok followers, a woman named Janet from Michigan, had started a GoFundMe page. Help Eddie bring his mama's recipes to America, she called it. The description made me sound like some kind of culinary folk hero, carrying on a tradition that needed saving. I watched the donations trickle, and like I was witnessing a small miracle. $5 from a teacher in Oregon, $20 from a grandmother in Florida, $50 from someone who said my video reminded them of their late father's cooking attempts. By the end of the week, strangers from across the country had sent me $2,500 with a simple message. Eddie, bake pies. We believe in you. Sitting in my kitchen, staring at that GoFundMe page on Kyle's laptop, I tried to process what had just happened. People I'd never met had decided my little pie experiment was worth investing in. It felt like the whole country had collectively decided to give me a second chance. The logistics were overwhelming. I couldn't bake commercially in my apartment. Health department wouldn't allow it, and my little oven couldn't handle more than one pie at a time anyway. Kyle suggested renting commercial kitchen space, but that sounded expensive and complicated. Then Miss Lizzie had one of her brilliant ideas. The Methodist church down the street had a big commercial kitchen they used for community dinners and fundraisers. Pastor Williams was always looking for ways to bring in extra income for the building fund. Maybe we could work something out. Pastor Williams turned out to be a practical man with a good head for business. He looked at Kyle's social media setup, tasted a slice of my apple pie, and shook my hand. Eddie, you can use our kitchen for $200 a month, plus 10% of whatever you make. Consider it a partnership between your pies and the Lord's work. He even suggested we talk to his lawyer friend about getting everything properly registered. I felt like I was stepping off a cliff, but sometimes that's exactly what you need to do. The church kitchen was a wonderland compared to my apartment setup. Industrial ovens that could handle 6 pies at once, mixers big enough to make dough for a small army, and enough counter space to actually work without knocking ingredients onto the floor. Kyle handled the technical stuff, payment processing, shipping labels, inventory tracking. Meanwhile, I needed to figure out the actual baking part. Making one pie in my kitchen was one thing. Making dozens for strangers across the country was something entirely different. That's where Sarah and Juan came in. These 2 kids from the local culinary college heard about my operation through the small-town gossip network and showed up at the church kitchen one Tuesday morning, looking ready to work. Sarah was a 22-year-old from Atlanta with purple streaks in her hair and enough energy to power a small city. One was a quiet kid from Savannah whose grandmother had taught him to bake before he could properly reach the counter. They both had that hungry look of students who knew they needed real-world experience more than they needed money. I can't pay you much right now, I told them honestly. Maybe a percentage of whatever we make, if we make anything at all. We can work out actual wages once this thing gets off the ground. They looked at each other and shrugged. Sarah spoke first. Mr. Russell, we're not doing this for money right now. We're doing this because your story is exactly why we wanted to learn how to cook in the first place. The first week was a complete disaster. We had orders for 30 pies, which seemed manageable until we actually tried to make 30 pies. The timing was all wrong. The packaging was inadequate, and I spent more time panicking than actually baking. The real crisis came when our first shipment to Texas arrived looking like it had been through a blender. The customer sent photos of what looked like apple pie soup, and I wanted to crawl under a rock and disappear forever. Sarah found me sitting in the church pew, head in my hands, wondering if I should refund everyone's money and go back to feeling sorry for myself. That's when Juan surprised me. This quiet kid who barely spoke above a whisper looked me in the eye and said something that changed everything. Mr. Russell, this isn't about perfect pies. This is about love in a box. People aren't buying your product because it's flawless. They're buying it because it means something to them. Sarah proved his point by redesigning our packaging system. Better boxes, more padding, dry ice for longer shipments. We spent the GoFundMe money on proper supplies and transformed our operation from amateur hour to something that actually looked professional. The orders started pouring in faster than we could handle. A woman from Iowa wanted 6 apple pies for a family reunion. A man from Alaska ordered a dozen for his office Christmas party. Someone from Chicago wrote that our apple pie tasted exactly like his childhood memories of his grandmother's kitchen on the South Side. But the order that really shocked me came from a chef in Portland. This guy ran some fancy restaurant I'd never heard of, and he wanted to try our pies for his dessert menu. A real chef wanted to serve my amateur pies to paying customers. I felt like I was living in some kind of fever dream. Kyle convinced me to expand beyond just apple pie. Your mom's notebook has other recipes, he pointed out. People are going to want variety. So Sarah, Juan, and I started experimenting together. They taught me techniques I'd never learned, and I shared Mom's secret ingredient combinations that somehow made perfect sense. The cherry pie was a revelation. Mom's notes mentioned using a touch of almond extract and a hint of lemon zest. Combinations I never would have thought of. One helped me perfect the timing, while Sarah figured out how to make the crust hold up during shipping. When I tasted the first successful batch, it was like Mom was standing right there in the kitchen, nodding her approval. Kyle also set up our Instagram account with photos that made everything look like it came from 1973, which apparently was exactly what people wanted. He took pictures of me in my beat-up tweed jacket, holding pies like they were Academy Awards. The vintage filter made our little church kitchen operation look like something out of a Norman Rockwell painting. The social media accounts exploded. People loved the story of the fired teacher who found his calling through his mother's recipe book. They shared the posts, tagged their friends, and turned my little pie operation into something that felt bigger than anything I'd ever accomplished in 35 years of teaching. But the real magic happened in the customer letters. People didn't just buy pies, they bought pieces of their own history. A woman from Denver wrote that our apple pie reminded her of Sunday dinners with her grandmother. A veteran from Texas said our pecan pie tasted like the holidays at his childhood home before his family fell apart. Even my own kids started paying attention. Susan texted me for the first time in months. "Dad, this is amazing." Grandma would be proud. Tommy called from California to ask if I was really becoming some kind of internet celebrity. For the first time in years, they seemed genuinely interested in what I was doing with my life. The breakthrough came when that Portland chef Marcus called to tell me he wanted to feature our pies as his signature dessert. Not just serve them, feature them. He was planning to put Etta's apple pie on his menu with a little story about the recipe's history. A real restaurant with real food critics was going to serve my pies to people who knew the difference between good and great. Sarah and Juan were more excited than I was. They understood what this meant for our little operation: legitimacy, credibility, proof that we weren't just playing around in a church kitchen. By this point, I was able to pay them actual wages instead of just percentages. Juan actually hugged me when I handed him his first real paycheck. By the end of our first month, we'd shipped over 200 pies to customers in 37 states. The numbers were staggering to me: revenue, profit margins, customer retention rates. Kyle tried to explain it all, but I was too busy trying to keep up with the actual bacon to worry about spreadsheets. The GoFundMe money was long gone, spent on proper equipment and ingredients and shipping supplies. But we were making real money. By the end of the second month, I'd paid Sarah and won more than I'd made in my first year of teaching. The church was getting their 10%, and I still had enough left over to actually feel successful. Sometimes life gives you nothing but flour and sugar and expects you to figure out the rest. That's what Mom had been trying to teach me all along, through every recipe she'd carefully written down in that old notebook. The moment that really hit me came on a Thursday afternoon. I was cleaning up the kitchen after a particularly busy day when I checked our monthly earnings on Kyle's laptop. The number seemed impossible. After paying Sarah and Juan, covering ingredients and shipping, and setting aside the church's 10%, I cleared $5,000. Pastor Williams found me staring at the screen in disbelief. He handed me an envelope with a smile. "This came for you today, a letter from one of your customers. Thought you might want to read it." Inside was a letter from an elderly woman in Nebraska whose granddaughter had ordered her one of our apple pies for her 90th birthday. She wrote that it was the first time in years that she'd tasted something that reminded her of home, of family, of being loved. "Mr. Russell," she wrote, "I don't know you, but your pie made me feel like I wasn't alone anymore. Thank you for giving me back a taste of home. That's worth more than money could ever buy." I looked down at the laptop screen, showing those impossible numbers, then at the letter in my hands, then at the ceiling of that quiet church kitchen, where everything had started to make sense again. Maybe I wasn't done yet. Maybe this was just the beginning of something I'd never imagined possible. $5,000 in 1 month. I'd never made that much money teaching, and here I was, earning it by baking pies with recipes my mother had written 60 years ago. Maybe flour and sugar really were the universe's way of saying, start over. Show them what you're made of. Sometimes the best second acts begin with nothing more than an old recipe and the courage to try again. Success has a way of sneaking up on you when you're not looking. One day you're wondering how to pay the electric bill, and the next you're depositing checks that have more zeros than you ever thought possible. By month 3, I wasn't just covering my rent and groceries anymore. I was actually living comfortably for the first time since Margaret died. The medical insurance I'd been putting off for months paid in full. That new tweed jacket I'd been eyeing at Macy's to replace my 20-year-old one, hanging in my closet. I even bought myself a decent coffee maker instead of drinking instant like some kind of barbarian. Then the media attention started. First, it was just a small piece in the local Savannah paper about the retired teacher who'd become an internet sensation. The headline read, "Teacher Who Fed America Memories." The reporter, a young woman named Ashley, spent an afternoon at the church kitchen watching us work and asking questions that made me sound more interesting than I'd ever felt. The article hit the paper on a Wednesday morning. By Friday, I'd gotten calls from 3 different food magazines and a producer from some cable cooking show I'd never heard of. Kyle was beside himself with excitement, talking about brand opportunities and media strategies like I was some kind of celebrity chef instead of a guy who'd learned to bake 3 months ago. That's when Roy Castellanos entered the picture. The 70-year-old guy had read the article in the Savannah paper and immediately ordered 6 different pies through our Etsy shop. He drove all the way down from Savannah to taste them himself, then showed up at the church kitchen on a Saturday morning, wearing a vintage bowling shirt and carrying a worn leather briefcase that looked like it had survived the Kennedy administration. "Eddie," he said, settling into a folding chair like he belonged there, "I'm a retired restaurant owner, and I've got to tell you, your pies aren't just food. They're time machines. People aren't just tasting apples and cinnamon. They're tasting their childhoods, their grandmother's kitchens, Sunday dinners that happened 50 years ago." Roy had owned 3 successful restaurants his day, all sold when he decided he wanted to spend his golden years fishing and playing poker. But something about my operation had gotten under his skin. He'd done his homework, researched our customer reviews, analyzed our social media engagement, even calculated our approximate monthly revenue. "You're sitting on something bigger than mail-order pies," he told me, pulling out a worn notebook that looked almost as old as Mom's recipe book. "What you need is a place where people can come and experience this in person. A restaurant that feels like stepping back in time." The idea terrified me. Opening a restaurant? I barely knew how to run a pie delivery service. Roy must have seen the panic in my eyes because he leaned back and smiled. "Eddie, I've got the restaurant experience and the capital. You got the magic recipes and the story people love. Together, we might just have something special." He showed me his business plan, complete with financial projections and market analysis. He'd already scouted a location, an old diner in downtown Savannah that had been closed for years but still had that authentic 1960s charm. The rent was reasonable, the kitchen was solid, and it was right in the heart of the tourist district. "I'd need to rent a small apartment there," he explained, since running a restaurant meant being there early and staying late. I wasn't convinced at first. The whole thing seemed too risky, too far outside my comfort zone. But then Roy showed me something that changed my mind, a stack of customer letters he convinced Kyle to share with him. People writing about how our pies had brought families together, sparked conversations about grandparents and childhood memories, made them feel less alone in the world. Roy looked me in the eye and said something I'll never forget. "Eddie, you're not just feeding people. You're giving them permission to remember, to feel connected to something larger than themselves. That's not just a business. That's a calling." We shook hands on it, right there in the church kitchen. Roy would handle permits, renovations, hiring in all the legal paperwork. I'd handle the recipes, staff training, and the heart of the operation. We'd split the profits 50-50, and both of us would work the floor, because people wanted to meet the guy behind the pies. The renovation took 8 weeks and nearly drove us both crazy. I'd rented a small studio apartment 2 blocks from the restaurant, splitting my time between Millbrook and Savannah while we got everything ready. We had to replace the entire ventilation system and battle the fire safety inspection twice. But Roy had connections with contractors and suppliers who understood the vision. Sarah and Juan drove down from Millbrook to help set up the kitchen systems, with Sarah managing the baking schedule like clockwork, while Juan perfected every recipe like it was a personal prayer. We transformed that tired old diner into something magical. Red and white checkered tablecloths, vintage vinyl records on the walls, a jukebox that played nothing but hits from the 50s and 60s. The whole place smelled like cinnamon and nostalgia. We hung Mom's quote above the counter, painted an elegant script. "A pie doesn't just feed, it embraces." Roy insisted on adding QR codes to every table, a modern touch that let customers scan and share their own family recipes. Old meets new, tradition meets technology. The staff Roy hired looked like they'd stepped out of American Graffiti. I joked that they looked like actors from Greece, except they were carrying pies instead of pompadours. Opening day was pure chaos. We'd advertise in the local paper and on social media, but nothing prepared us for the line that formed outside at 6 a.m. People had driven from Atlanta, Jacksonville, even Birmingham. Some had come specifically because they'd ordered our pies online and wanted to experience the full retro lunch atmosphere. The first customer was an elderly woman named Dorothy who'd grown up in Savannah in the 1950s. She took one bite of our apple pie and started crying right there at table 12. Her daughter explained that it tasted exactly like the pies her grandmother used to make for Sunday dinner. Within an hour, half the restaurant was sharing stories about their own family food memories. Roy worked the room like a politician, charming customers and making everyone feel like they were part of something special. I stayed mostly in the kitchen but would come out occasionally to check on things. People would recognize me from the TikTok videos and want to shake hands, take photos, share their own stories about family recipes and childhood memories. The financial success was immediate and overwhelming. We were clearing $7,000 a month after expenses, employees, and Roy's cut. I was making more money than I'd ever made as a teacher, doing something I genuinely loved with people who appreciated what we were creating. 3 months after opening, I got a call that caught me completely off guard. It was David Martinez, one of my former students who became the assistant principal at Millbrook High. The school wanted to invite me to their annual alumni dinner as guest of honor. The same institution that had unceremoniously fired me 8 months earlier now wanted to celebrate my success. I thought about it for exactly 30 seconds before declining. I told David I was busy, but the truth was simpler than that. I no longer taught history in a classroom with desks and bells. Sometimes a classroom is a booth with checkered tablecloths, and your students are anyone who takes a bite and remembers where they came from. The restaurant became more than just a business. It became a gathering place, a community center where strangers became friends over shared memories of grandmother's kitchens and Sunday dinners. Families would drive hours to eat there. Tour groups would stop by on their way through Savannah. Food bloggers wrote about the authentic atmosphere and incredible pies. Susan brought her kids to retro lunch last weekend. She said it smelled exactly like Grandma Etta's kitchen. We both cried. For the first time in years, my children seemed genuinely proud of what their old man was accomplishing. But the moment that really got me happened on a busy Saturday afternoon. I was refilling coffee cups when I noticed a young mother at table 6 feeding her 3-year-old daughter a bite of our cherry pie. The little girl's eyes lit up, and she started giggling. Her mother took a bite herself and immediately started crying. Not sad tears, but the kind that come from unexpected joy. I watched from across the room as this woman hugged her daughter and whispered something in her ear. Later, she told me that the pie tasted exactly like the ones her own mother used to make before she passed away last year. She'd been struggling with grief, feeling disconnected from her family's traditions. Standing there in that busy restaurant, listening to the conversations and laughter, watching families create new memories over food that honored old ones, I realized something profound. This wasn't just about pies anymore. This was about legacy, the threads that connect us across generations through the simple act of feeding people with love and intention. Sometimes, to find your place in the world, you have to return to where everything began, not to the job that rejected you, but to the values that shaped you. Mom's recipes have become a bridge between memory and reality, between loneliness and belonging. The restaurant hummed with energy and purpose every single day. Watching that little girl laugh while her mother remembered her own childhood, I understood that this was more than a business. This was a living testament to the power of food to heal, to connect, to remind us that we're all part of something larger than ourselves. This was legacy in action, and it was just the beginning. 6 months after Retro Lunch opened, I got a call that surprised me more than anything that had happened since this whole crazy journey began. It was from the new principal at Millbrook High, a woman named Janet Patterson, who'd taken over after Morrison got quietly transferred to some administrative position following a few too many parent complaints and an unfavorable district audit. The school board wanted to invite me back as guest of honor for their annual Heritage Night celebration. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same institution that had tossed me out like yesterday's garbage now wanted to parade me around as their success story. But Janet sounded genuine when she explained that the current students had been following my story on social media and were asking questions about the teacher who become famous for baking pies. I almost said no. The wounds from my firing were still tender, even wrapped in the success of everything that had happened since. But then I remembered something Mom used to say about forgiveness, being more for yourself than for the people who wronged you. Maybe it was time to close that particular chapter properly. I agreed to come with one condition. I'd bring pies for everyone. Students, teachers, administrators, the whole bunch. If they wanted to celebrate my story, they were going to taste how it all began. Sarah and Juan helped me load up my old pickup truck with 30 apple pies, still warm from the retro lunch ovens. Walking back into that school felt like stepping through a time machine. The hallways smelled the same. That mixture of floor cleaner, teenage anxiety, and cafeteria food that every high school in America somehow manages to perfect. My old classroom had been turned into a computer lab, but the windows still looked out onto the same parking lot where I'd stood 8 months earlier, holding Mom's recipe book and wondering what the hell I was going to do with the rest of my life. The assembly was packed. Current students, former colleagues, parents, even some of my old students who'd driven back to town just to see their former history teacher who'd gone viral. Principal Patterson introduced me with words that would have made my mother proud and my former principal choke on his coffee. The kids asked the kinds of questions that reminded me why I'd loved teaching in the first place. How did you know the pies would work? What would you tell someone who's afraid to take risks? Do you miss being a teacher? I told them the truth. That I'd never stopped being a teacher. I just found a different classroom. Don't give up on history, I said with a grin. But if you do, make sure you know how to bake. That night, driving back to Savannah with an empty truck and a full heart, I realized something had shifted. The anger I'd been carrying around for months had finally started to dissolve. Not because of any apology, but because I'd finally stopped needing one. The school visit got me thinking about legacy in a way I hadn't before. Sure, retro lunch was successful, still bustling every weekend with more laughter than orders, and that was just fine with me. Our online pie orders were keeping Sarah, Juan, and Kyle busier than ever. But what would happen to all these family recipes when the people who remembered them were gone? That's when I came up with what Kyle later called my most brilliant idea yet. We were going to create an online archive, America's Culinary Memory. We called it a place where people could submit their family recipes along with the stories behind them, not just the ingredients and instructions, but the memories, the traditions, the connections that made each dish special. Kyle built the website in 2 weeks, and within a month we had our first 100 submissions. A woman from Idaho sent her great-grandmother's cherry pie recipe along with a story about how it fed 4 generations of farmers through good harvests and bad. A man from Louisiana submitted his grandmother's bread pudding recipe with a note about how she'd used day-old beignet from the bakery, where she worked to feed 8 children during the Depression. Within 6 months, we had 5,000 recipes. Within a year, 15,000. The archive became its own viral phenomenon, with people sharing their submissions on TikTok and Instagram, filming themselves making their grandmother's recipes, telling stories about the women and men who'd fed their families with love and creativity. A food historian from the Smithsonian reached out to ask if we'd consider partnering with them to preserve some of the more historically significant submissions. The Food Network wanted to do a documentary series. Publishers were calling about cookbook deals. Roy stopped by last week, said he'd never seen a business touch this many lives, and he'd run 3 restaurants in his prime. The media attention was flattering, but it wasn't why I'd started the project. Every time someone submitted a recipe, they were doing what I'd done with Mom's notebook, keeping something precious alive, making sure it wouldn't be lost when they were gone. One newspaper reporter asked me if I ever regretted leaving teaching for the food business. I wanted to change the world through history. I told her, but it turned out pies were more powerful than textbooks. Food carries our stories forward into the future in ways that textbooks never could. The financial success meant I was comfortable for the first time in years. I wasn't flying first class, but I had health insurance, a paid-off truck, and never miss a grandkid's birthday. Tommy flew in from California last month with his kids, said they wanted to see the pie place Grandpa built. Susan sent me a photo last Thanksgiving. Her daughter had baked Mom's cherry pie. Said it was the first time the family sat at the table without arguing. But the real wealth was in the letters and emails that arrived every day. People thanking me for inspiring them to reconnect with their family recipes. Grandchildren learning to cook from their grandmothers because they'd seen our story. Families gathering around dinner tables to share stories about the past while eating food that tasted like memory. Sarah had taken over most of the day-to-day operations at Retro Lunch, and Juan was considering opening his own bakery in Atlanta. Kyle was talking about expanding the archive to include family stories beyond just recipes, maybe immigration documents, old photographs, anything that helped preserve family history. As for me, I split my time between the restaurant and my little apartment in Savannah, though I still kept my place in Millbrook. Some evenings, I'd sit in the restaurant after closing, listening to Sinatra on the jukebox and reading through recipe submissions on my laptop. The combination of old and new, tradition and technology, felt exactly right. One quiet Tuesday evening, I was doing exactly that when I decided to flip through Mom's original recipe notebook one more time. Somehow, I'd never noticed a loose piece of paper tucked into the back cover. It was a note in Mom's handwriting, dated just a few months before she died. Eddie, it read, "If you're reading this, it means you finally opened this old book and found something worth keeping. Cook with love, and the world will love you back." The secret ingredient in every recipe isn't cinnamon or sugar. It's the hope that someone will taste what you've made and feel less alone in the world. Make me proud, son. I sat there in that empty restaurant, surrounded by checkered tablecloths and vintage records, holding a note from my mother that I'd somehow missed for 5 years. The timing felt too perfect to be accidental. Maybe she'd known somehow that I'd need to find those words at exactly the right moment. Life isn't about how much money you make or how many people know your name. It's about how many hearts you warm, how many people feel a little less alone because you were here. Mom had been teaching me that lesson my whole life, but it took losing everything I thought mattered to finally understand what she meant. I looked around the restaurant, at the photos of happy customers on the walls, at the shelf full of submitted recipe cards from the archive, at the framed copy of that first TikTok video that had started it all. This wasn't just a business anymore. It was a living testament to the power of food to connect us to our past and carry our stories forward. Standing up, I walked over to the jukebox and put on Sinatra's My Way. The familiar melody filled the empty restaurant, and I could almost hear Mom humming along from the kitchen. I'd done it my way, all right, but it turned out my way was really her way. Feeding people, caring for them, making sure they knew they mattered. I pulled out my phone and took a picture of Mom's note, then posted it to our Instagram account with a simple caption. The secret ingredient was love all along. Within an hour, it had been shared 1,000 times. People understood. They got it. As Sinatra crooned about facing the final curtain, I looked up at Mom's photo on the wall. The one Kyle had enlarged and framed from an old snapshot I'd found in the recipe book. She was standing in her church kitchen, flour in her hair and a smile on her face, surrounded by pies cooling on the counter. "Mom," I whispered to that quiet restaurant, "I finally figured it out. Thank you for the notebook. Thank you for showing me that the best legacy isn't what you achieve. It's what you leave behind for others to build on." The jukebox clicked to the next song, and I headed home to my little apartment. The oven was off, the dining room empty, but my heart felt full, like the last bite of good pie, still warm with memory. Tomorrow would bring new recipes to preserve, new stories to share, new ways to help people feel connected to something larger than themselves. It wasn't the life I planned, but looking back from that jukebox glow, it was the one I'd been baking toward all along.